Now we'll move on to the third branch of the federal government, known as the Judicial Branch. This branch includes the courts and its judges. In this first lesson on the Judicial Branch, we will explore how the Constitution and early political writings built the foundation for judicial power and independence in the United States. First, we will look at how Article 3 of the Constitution outlines the structure and power of the Judicial Branch. Then we'll explore how Federalist Number 78 argues that judicial independence helps check the power of the other branches. Let's start with Article 3. This article establishes a national court system, led by the Supreme Court. It sets the basic rules for how the courts work and why they matter. Before Article 3, there was no national court system at all. So Article 3 was important because it created a new branch of government focused just on interpreting laws. To understand Article 3 fully, we'll look at three parts: the role of Article 3, the powers it gives the courts, and how it helps keep the judiciary independent. Okay, let's pause there for a second. You might be realizing already that there are going to be a lot of ideas and concepts you're going to need to remember. That's why I've made the 4-hour exam-ready playbook, a study and review guide that you can complete while watching the video. Grab it through the link in the description and practice what you're learning while watching, all in just 4 hours. With this guide, it's never too late to prepare for the exam. Now, let's get back to the lesson. Firstly, Article 3 says that the United States has one Supreme Court, and Congress can create other lower courts if needed. The Constitution doesn't say how many judges there should be or how the courts should run. That's up to Congress. But it makes clear that courts have the power to settle legal disagreements. Secondly, Article 3 gives federal courts the power to interpret the wording of the Constitution, laws made by Congress, and disagreements between states. It is the role of the courts to say whether actions are legal or illegal. Thirdly, Article 3 also helps protect the courts from political pressure by saying that judges serve for life unless they break the law. It also says that their pay can't be lowered while they are in office. These two protections are there to make sure judges can make decisions based on the law, not based on what Congress or the president might want. Okay, let's move on to Federalist Number 78, which explains why judicial independence is essential. This document was written by Alexander Hamilton. We'll break down the three key ideas from this essay: the importance of independence, the power of judicial review, and the limits on judicial power. First, let's talk about the importance of independence. Hamilton argued that the courts must be separate from the other branches to make fair and unbiased decisions. Judges need to be able to follow the Constitution, even if it means going against what Congress or the president wants. Next is the power of judicial review. This is the idea that courts can strike down laws that go against the Constitution. Hamilton explained that the Constitution is a higher law, and it's the court's job to make sure all other laws follow it. Finally, let's look at the limits on judicial power. Hamilton knew that some people were afraid the courts would become too powerful. He reassured them by saying that the judicial branch is the least dangerous of the three. Courts don't control money, don't control armies, and can't write laws. Their only power is to interpret laws that already exist. Okay, that brings us to the end of this first lesson on the judicial branch. On the screen now are the key terms from this lesson. If you're following along with the study guide and free response question mastery playbook, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll dive right into Topic 2.9. In this lesson, we will explore how the judicial branch makes decisions and how those decisions can change over time. First, we'll look at the concept of stare decisis. Then we'll look at how the changing makeup of the Supreme Court can shift its decisions and even overturn past rulings. First, let's look at the meaning of stare decisis. Stare decisis is a Latin phrase that means, let the decision stand. It is the legal principle that courts should follow earlier rulings, called precedents, when deciding cases that are similar. A precedent is a past decision made by a court that acts as a guide for future cases. This idea keeps the law consistent and helps people know what to expect from the justice system. Judges don't always have to follow precedent, but they usually do unless there's a very strong reason to change direction, like a past decision being outdated or clearly unfair. Okay, let's move on to how changes in the Supreme Court can affect its decisions. This part of the lesson has three key parts: how justices are appointed, the impact of new appointments, and how these appointments can lead to overturned precedents. First, let's look at how justices are appointed. Supreme Court justices are nominated by the president and must be confirmed or rejected by the Senate. Presidents often nominate justices whose judgments tend to agree with their political and legal beliefs. If the president and Senate are controlled by the same party, it's more likely that the president will manage to appoint a Supreme Court justice whose legal judgments tend to side with their political views. Once the Supreme Court justice is confirmed, they serve for life unless they retire, resign, or are removed through impeachment and trial in Congress. Only one justice in history has been impeached. His name was Justice Samuel Chase, and his 1804 impeachment by the House failed to remove him from the court because the Senate trial acquitted him. He continued to serve on the court until his death in 1811. This shows how hard it is to remove a Supreme Court justice once they have been approved. Next, let's look at the impact of new appointments. Every justice brings their own way of thinking about the Constitution and the role of government. Over time, as older justices leave and new ones are appointed, the overall beliefs of the court can shift. A court that was once more liberal might become more conservative, or the other way around. This shift affects how the court rules on major issues like civil rights, gun laws, or abortion. When the makeup of the court changes, the new majority may ignore stare decisis because they see some past decisions as being wrongly adjudicated. A famous recent example was the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization in 2022. A string of conservative appointments to the Supreme Court by President Trump created a situation where there was a majority of justices willing to overturn the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision on legal abortion. This ended federal protection for the practice of abortion and returned the issue to the states. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson on how the judicial branch uses precedent and how its decisions can shift with changes in the court. On the screen now are the key terms from this lesson. If you're following along with the study guide and free response question mastery playbook, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll dive right into topic 2.10. This lesson goes deeper on an issue we've already touched on previously: judicial independence. This means that the Supreme Court operates independently of the other branches of government. It doesn't have to do what the President or Congress demand of it. In this lesson, we'll explore how it keeps its independence, and then start our discussion on debates over the court having too much power. Let's start with how judicial independence is achieved. The main mechanism for achieving independence is life tenure. As we've seen in the previous lesson, this means that justices don't have to run for re-election and are not pushed out of office. This rule is written into the Constitution and was designed to keep judges free from the pressure of elections or changing public opinions. If justices had to worry about being re-elected or reappointed, they might change their rulings to stay popular instead of focusing on what the law says. Thanks to judicial independence, the court sometimes makes decisions that go against what much of the public wants or what the other branches of government prefer. For example, in Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples have a constitutional right to marry, even though 35 out of 50 states had laws banning same-sex marriage at the time. Next, let's talk about debates about the Supreme Court's power, which often happen after a controversial court decision. When the Supreme Court makes a decision that changes a national law or strikes down something passed by Congress, some people argue that the court is overstepping its authority. These critics believe that 9 unelected justices should not have the final say in major political questions. If the majority of a democratic country wants something to happen, the court shouldn't have the power to stop it. Others argue that the court is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect the Constitution, even when that means saying no to the other branches of government or the majority of voters. That's where this lesson ends, but the next lesson is going to dive deeper into debates about the power of the judicial branch and how other branches of government have made strides to limit the Supreme Court's power. If you're following along with the study guide and free response question mastery playbook, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on. And when you're ready, we'll dive right into topic 2.11. In this lesson, we will explore how the power of the Supreme Court can be limited or challenged in a democratic system. First, we will look at the ongoing debate over how judicial review should be used by the court. Then we'll examine the formal ways that the other branches, and even the states, can place limits on the court's power. Let's start with the debate over judicial review. Judicial review is the power of the court to strike down laws or government actions that it finds unconstitutional. But not everyone agrees on how often or how boldly the court should use this power. There are two main views here: judicial activism and judicial restraint. Let's look at both. We'll begin with judicial activism. Judicial activism is the belief that the courts should not be afraid to use judicial review to strike down laws or executive actions, even if doing so means changing how we've interpreted the Constitution in the past. People who support this view often think the court should take an active role in protecting rights and updating how we understand the law to match the needs of modern society. Now let's turn to judicial restraint. Judicial restraint is the opposite idea. It says the courts should be very careful about intervening in congressional decisions and the law. Judges who follow this view believe that they should stick closely to what past court decisions say and avoid making big changes unless absolutely necessary. The idea is to leave most decisions to the elected branches, Congress and the President, who represent the people directly. So, judicial activists are more willing to overturn judicial precedent and assert the power of the courts, while judicial restraint is all about standing back and making minimal changes or interventions. Okay, let's move on to the formal ways the court's power can actually be limited by other parts of the government. These are important to understand because even though the court is independent, it's not untouchable. There are 5 key formal checks we'll look at: congressional legislation, constitutional amendments, appointments and confirmations, implementation delays, and limits on the court's jurisdiction. First is congressional legislation. The Supreme Court's job is to interpret laws when resolving disputes. It isn't the court's role to write laws. But sometimes the court interprets a law in a way that Congress doesn't like. In response, Congress can make changes to the wording of their laws, so the Supreme Court is compelled to interpret the laws in the way Congress desires. Here's an example. Let's say Congress passes a law. Later, the Supreme Court interprets the law in a way Congress didn't intend or doesn't like. Congress can then turn around and rewrite the law to make it clearer. Now, the Supreme Court is compelled to interpret it in the way Congress intended. In this way, Congress can use its power to write laws in a way that prevents the Supreme Court from making rulings that Congress doesn't like. Of course, Congress can't write laws that conflict with the Constitution, so this check only works for laws within Congress's power, not constitutional laws. If anyone wanted to force the Supreme Court to reinterpret the Constitution, they might need to do something more drastic, like pass constitutional amendments. This would require enough lawmakers and states to agree, and it's a high bar. This is rare, but it has happened before. Here's an example. In the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision of 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that enslaved people were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. 9 years later, the 14th Amendment was passed, which overturned Dred Scott by adding new text to the Constitution. Among other provisions, this included citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. As a result, the Supreme Court was compelled to recognize the rights of former slaves. A third way to limit the power of the Supreme Court is the appointments and confirmations process. You already know about this from the previous lesson, so I'll be really brief. The President nominates justices to the court, and the Senate confirms them. Over time, these appointments can shift the ideological balance of the court, leading to new approaches to interpreting the Constitution. Fourth is implementation delays. Even if the court makes a ruling, it doesn't control how that ruling is carried out. Sometimes presidents or states drag their feet or refuse to act at all, delaying the effect of the court's decision. This happened after Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Some states resisted the ruling and were very slow to integrate schools. Fifth and finally is jurisdiction stripping. Congress can pass laws that prevent the court from hearing certain types of cases by removing its jurisdiction. Basically, Congress can't stop the Supreme Court from hearing cases about the Constitution, but it can limit what kinds of other cases the court is allowed to hear. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson on how the power of the Supreme Court can be checked and limited. On the screen now are the key terms from this lesson. If you're following along with the study guide and free response question mastery playbook, check your answers for this section using the answer key before moving on.